because this roundtable will be held by the Circle U. That is a consortium. Circle U is an organization, a consortium of international universities, and so we will use English for this roundtable. So this roundtable would explore the fields for the agency and the reification versus the reification of plants. First, Quentin Hiernaux will start the discussion around the origin of the reification of plants, and he will question how this opposes the awareness of the agency or agentivity of plants. And then after, Nathalie Blanc will discuss how the way of conceiving plants influences or not the aesthetics, and not only the aesthetics, but the practices of nature in cities. And then Sylvie Pouteau will follow up by positioning these reflections in a more general way around questions of ethics. And last but not least, Cécile Renouard will conclude this roundtable by examining what could be the company's responsibility in the challenge of nature ethics. And this latter point would would provide a good transition between what we discussed today and what will be discussed on the second day of the conference, since this symposium is cut in two. Well, let's say that first, this day, the first day today focused on the the plant, why there is a plant blindness, and tomorrow we will discuss solutions and path to solutions eventually. So I was too long enough, and I let the mic to Quentin Hiernaux.
Okay, thank you. So I don't know. Oh, yes. I'm going to speak about the origins of plant reification, as I am the first to speak at this one table. So let me speak about history, and more specifically about history of philosophy and history of sciences, which are my main disciplines. So first, let me introduce reification by a definition. In fact, in philosophy, reification is the process by which something moving, dynamic is transformed into a fixed, static being. You can easily understand that plants, when they are reificated, are considered as objects and not anymore as truly living beings. We had a former example during the previous session about that, because plant reification, in fact, is typical of our Western, Occidental, modern way of thinking in philosophy and in science. And I will shortly introduce you to the topic by some example and some main elements that may explain why our culture consider plants as we do. Why to do that? But first, because it was for a long time unquestioned, but now there are a lot of ethical problems. Sylvie Pouteau told us about that earlier, but in fact there are many other problems about plant ethics that were not mentioned, about environmental issues, agricultural one, food, and so on. So we need to think about that, and so it is interesting to know what's the history of the problem. So if we go back to the roots of our Western philosophy, of course we can go back as far as Greek philosophers, And it is interesting to notice that in pre-Socratic philosophy, there were no difference between living organization and non-living organization. This difference occurred, in fact, with Plato and Aristotle, who were the first to consider a theory of life in itself. And they introduced the topic of explanation of life through the very important concept in our culture of soul, in fact, the soul. For Plato, every living being is able to desire something or to suffer, in a sense, something. So do plants also. But they don't have intelligence or rational faculties as a human being endowed with a rational soul. Aristotle, who was very important in our scientific and philosophical tradition, was more radical than Plato, because he considered that plant had only the vegetative part or faculty of the soul, which is in fact the ability to grow, to nourish themselves and to reproduce and then decay and die. They are not rational either, as Plato said, but they are not sensitive anymore. As a consequence, they don't have pain and pleasure, and they are not able to desire something. From that way of characterizing plants, Aristotle concludes that plants are also immobile and passive, because the animal model was the center of his talk to think about these abilities. So you don't have to move if you are not able to feel something or to desire something. This is the main argument. Nevertheless, Aristotle didn't defend a biological hierarchy or a moral hierarchy on that grounds. He just considered that there were differences, and it was interesting for him to elaborate a theory of life in its treatise. The main problem about plant reification, in fact, appeared during the Western and modern medieval, so the medieval and modern philosophical tradition that inherited the Aristotelian tradition and then elaborated a very negative way to consider plants as lacking beings. So they lack mobility, they lack sensitivity, but they also lack some moral consideration as a consequence, because they added during that time a clear hierarchy on the biological differences among plants and animals, according to the idea of a scala natura, or a chain of being. So the idea that there are steps, hierarchical steps going from the mineral world to the vegetal one, and then to the human one, angel in the sky, and then God. So the religious influence of the Bible is also important in our Western tradition to understand why we reificated plants. Because in the first chapters on the Genesis, for instance, it is said that plants are made to nourish animals and humans. So the raison d'être of plants is to nourish other animals and a human being. Plants are not created as animals were, but they are more or less created by Earth, in fact. They are kind of emergence of the power of the Earth. So they are not directly created by the divine breath like animals and humans. So from the very beginning in our religious tradition, there is ontological very strong difference between animals and humans, and plants on the other hand. So the conjunction of Aristotelianism and Christianism did influence our Western culture, but also modern sciences, that are strongly influenced by this philosophy, and especially plant sciences until today. So just a few examples about the way early modern sciences were influenced by that way of thinking. For example, since the 16th century, we do know, botanists do know, did know that there were plant movements and that plants were able to move and to react, and they were able to observe that. But it contradicts the ideological way, or traditional way of thinking plants as passive and immobile and inactive beings. So it was very complicated for them to combine these observations with the ideological and philosophical way of thinking about life at the time. So one of the solutions that was proposed at the time, for example, you can find that in Andrea Cesalpino, who was one of the first physiologists or modern botanists. So one of their solution is to promote a kind of physical determinism to explain plants and the movement and reaction of plants according to what you can observe in the mineral world, in fact. So, in a sense, the sap movement is like the imbibition of the soil, for example. Or the movement you can observe in plants is probably something comparable to the magnetism, for example. So they propose some kind of very deterministic and physical hypothesis to explain something that could not be at the time considered as a true agency in plants. And of course, later scientists inherited that way of thinking, and even in the 19th century, so experimental biology developed, but traditional animal physiologists were very reluctant to admit that we could speak about a plant physiology, because the word physiology in itself was still associated with animal sensation and movement. So they were very reluctant to consider that the same biological discipline could be applied to plants and to animals, because of the former ontological difference I explained. So today scientists recognize, of course, that there is a true plant physiology, which is not problematic in itself, but the scientific community is now very reluctant to recognize active behaviors in plants. So it's not the problem of sensitivity, which is the main problem now in biology. It's more the problem of rationality, to restate the problem in the Aristotelian or traditional way. So agency in plants, the fact that they are, for example, able to learn, to choose, or to decide, is very polemic. And it is very difficult to explain with our traditional vocabulary the way they do the things they do. So in spite of the theory of evolution, we are still influenced by the idea that plant would be a separated kingdom with some essential or so-called essential properties, which is really a problem from a biological point of view, because we know that there are phylogenetical bonds that unite animal and plants, and a real continuity between all creatures or organisms. So in plant physiology, a lot of experimenters still consider that plant behavior are simpler to explain and determined by physico-chemical laws or by the genetic program, which is a new way of actualizing the physical determinism in biology, in fact. However, outside the labs, we can see that plants are far more complex in natural ecosystem and environment, that there are a lot of things that we cannot explain in these very deterministic models. So this reification of plants has epistemological and scientific consequences. And to conclude, I would like to emphasize to really underline the fact that this way of thinking plants has deep consequence of our ethical of our ethics today and the ethics of life we want to promote, because it's not possible anymore to ignore that plants are not just resources or just part of the surrounding, but they are in themselves organisms with their own activity, their own behavior, and also, more importantly, maybe they are also really important agent and parts of ecosystems. So that was what I want. Oh, yeah, it's okay.
So thank you, Quentin, for this short but very precise contribution. What I would like, I totally forgot. Perhaps the better way to have a real discussion is to have each a short communication for 15 minutes, and then discuss and ask questions to everybody at the table and make answer for everybody in the room. It's perhaps more dynamic than having just a question and then another and then question. Okay? If everybody agrees with that, if I was clear enough, and if my English is not too broken.
Maybe we can say that it's possible to ask questions in French, just for people who want to speak in French.
Yeah. If you're not okay with English, you can ask your question in French, and we will translate. Yeah, d'accord. So. I don't remember. Yeah, this is. Oh, no. I will like to invite Nathalie.
Thank you. As I spoke earlier, I will be short. I will just jump on this reification theme. Well, if you think of how we treated plants in the city, you think of three things which explain the reification. First is the color. I mean, the color in cities played a big role, the green color, and we'll discuss it a bit more. The second one is about the fact that plants are still, contrary to the animals. I mean, you can't draw an animal on a plan, on a map, or, you know, it was contrary. And animals have always defied the fact of drawing and planifying the city. I mean, it's something that you can't do. And the last one, I mean, I guess you could find more criteria, but it's, for me, three symptoms of the reification: the color, the immobility, and its aesthetic character, meaning its decorative character. I mean, if you find, and I'll discuss one of these three themes briefly, just to have a discussion with all of you. It's about the color. So at first, when I tried to research about this green color, I thought, yeah, well, this is the color of the garden, so that explains how people do feel about plants and how green is important. But if you go back in history, if you go and read Pastoureau, for example, Michel Pastoureau is a well-known historian of the color. He explains that we knew nothing about the green before the 18th century, 18 or 19 even, and that the green was not attached to the vegetation at all. I mean, that was something very different. So we didn't have this representation. And differently from the blue, you know that green is a mixture of blue and yellow, and differently from the blue, the green color is, that's what he says, because it is a production of a mixture. It's synonymous of the evil. I mean, that's very strange. And he say, because in Middle Age, when you mixed things, it was this operation were judged infernal because you don't mix. You just keep things pure. So it's something, you don't mix two primitive things to make a third one. So, and the color green was a mixture. So, for example, that's what he explained in, I don't know how you call this, but you know, the professional, the people who did have as a job to taint the textiles, they had separate basin for blue and yellow, and very separate. And that was an order in order just to keep things pure. So, and this color was not very important before the 18th century. So it's like, that's after Newton, that's what he says, that Newton gave us another way of thinking about colors. I mean, because he spoke of colors as being the result of the light spectrum. So that's, colors were not in themselves, you know, like given in nature, but they were the result of something that came from elsewhere. So that's very different, and the green color in itself was fixed up in the 18th century, and at first it was a poisonous color with arsenic. So there is a green book, which is very well known. I think there is just one exemplary of it. And you suppose some people, it's a legend that says that, they have touched the green book and died of it. I can't remember the name of the book, but it's very well known. And recently there was a European program about the green color with many chemists and many people working on this color. And they discovered again all this tradition about the green color. Okay, so green, it's a very difficult color, very unstable, very rebel, and chemically very interesting, but not linked to vegetation. And that's what's, when you investigate as why is, to what color or to what element the vegetation was defined. I mean, it was mostly fire, air, water, earth, and there is only a bit of the vocabulary that suggests a relation between green and vegetation. It's the Latin word viridis, which associates energy, virility, and the growth of vegetation. And if you want to link, I won't stay too long on this path, but if you want to link green and garden and renewal of oneself, you have to turn yourself towards the Arabic tradition and the Arabic vocabulary. So it's not a Christian tradition vocabulary. That's the result of my investigation. Other languages, such as Russian, do find a link between the color and the nature, such as, for example, you call flower of the name of red, for example, as being synonymous of the springtime, of the color in the snow, but it's not the case in our language. So it was in the 19th century only that the green color was invented as a sanitary word. You know, when you say in French, va au vert, meaning, I can't even translate it, meaning go rest yourself in the green, you know. And so you just pinpoint how the color is synonymous as well of plants, as well of health. So it's like the link between the two, once again, is very strong. So it comes after the 18th century, and especially with cities, you know, as people were supposed to leave the gray of the city, the concrete, all these colors, for green. So this opposition, very strong nowadays, in between gray and green, as synonymous of illness and health, is a strong way of constructing a reification of plant. I will stop there.
Thank you very much. So we will hear Sylvie. Do you want me to Sylvie has a presentation.
Yes.
So I'm going to move.
Okay, so in my experience, plant ethics is closely linked to agricultural and food ethics. So I would like to present a few arguments, and some of them which I have already presented a few times, and especially recently at the World Congress of Organic Farming, which was held in France. And I would like to remind you some of... thank you. Next one. To remind you some of the context, the European context in which plant ethics arose. I've already mentioned this morning the issue of the dignity of creatures in the Swiss Constitution. And so I will give a few more details. And in the continuity of this, the initial International Congress 20 years ago, and then the publication of the first report in 2008 for in the case of plants, and then the publication of a volume on plant ethics, which was directed by Professor Angela Kaloff in Vienna, who was one contributor to the reflection on the Würde der Kreatur in Switzerland. So, in fact, the history goes back further in the past, because it started already in the 1970s. And this was closely linked to the development of genetic engineering and genetic modification, especially after the first conference on the issue, the Asilomar Conference in 1975. And then this fueled some discussion and debates. And in Switzerland, the first occurrence of the term Würde der Kreatur goes back to 1980. The first creation of a GM plant, genetically modified plant, was in 1983, and the first commercialization of a GM crop was in about 10 years later, and then started all the controversies that you're probably aware of them. Now, something which is separate but not completely separate was the creation of the European Society of Agricultural and Food Ethics. Altogether, I mentioned these different points, and I'm not an historian, so I'm just trying to give you insight in the experience I've gained through my studies. So, in the European context, the genetic modification was very important for the articulation of the enunciation of plant ethics. And so this means that these issues have been raised in the context of agriculture. So plant issues are crop issues. The term crop welfare is probably not appropriate. So there are different terms which have been used. I've already mentioned dignity, integrity, inherent value, intrinsic value. We heard of intrinsic value this morning, etc. I think, there's a difficulty as to how to define welfare. Flourishing seems to be quite a promising concept because it links together a descriptive assessment and a normative assessment. But there is a difficulty is to, again, is how to define the good life for a plant. So if we want to go beyond vitality and typicity, then we are in need of a narrative which would account for transformation in the field of agriculture. And I like this quote by Paul Ricoeur in the definition of ethics as a narrative identity is how to remain oneself while becoming another. And I think this would be useful for defining the good life for a plant. So this could be translated in how to express a plant's potentiality to the full extent through ongoing transformation, and how to make fruitful encounters with other beings, especially human beings. Then I think the notion of gradation could be useful also to make an evaluation, an assessment of what is gradation versus degradation. So I've already explained this morning this Goethean framework on which I'm trying to work now. And I think we have to imagine ontologies not simply as fixed stereotypes, but as dynamic ontologies and interwoven ontologies. Now, I'm especially concerned by the current evolution in agriculture, because there is more and more investment in the field of automation and robotics and the development of smart technology. So what will be the interaction between people, farmers, and their crops? And so there are some proposition for the future of agriculture, which will be digital agriculture, and this will be driven by artificial intelligence. So there is no need in this case of any people in the fields or among the crops. And in the backstage of this development, there is obviously the big data, which is this enormous amount of data collected by captors and sensors. And this, there is a need to develop digital semantics and vocabularies which will redefine plant ontologies. And these plant ontologies are defined by people who have no interactions with plants and who are biocomputing engineers. And also this is not defined anymore with people, I mean, in society. So to come back to the subject, I mean, of this conference, crop agentivities, it would be, I think agentivity can be a misleading word, but it can be also useful to oppose the term functions, which is embedded in the current science, biological sciences. And there is a difficulty also and a need to discriminate between metaphors and analogies and homologies. And I always make a focus on nutrition because nutrition is not appropriate because crops do not eat, they do not ingest, they do not digest. And sexual reproduction is also misleading because reproduction only occurs when a seed meets adequate soil condition. So my advice is to introduce new theoretical guidelines for an organic agentive framework. So I would prefer the term potentiality and telecheia, which I've already mentioned this morning, and all the gradated expressions which apply to these notions. And this means that gradation encompasses the production of seeds, well, it goes from plant breeding to all the, the process of production of food and nutrition. So I would expand the notion of crop agentivity to encompass all this complex process, because agentivity is the whole of agriculture, and it includes seed agentivity, it includes crop agentivity, and food manufacturing, and people health and flourishing, etc., and society development. Is it the last one? I don't. No, sorry. Well, yes. Just to mention the the problem with the metaphor of nutrition. We see it here. These are not war pictures, but these are industrial catastrophes, and they have in common nitrate. And so nitrate is in the next one. Yes, nitrate. The industrial production of nitrate was first developed in the First World War, and it was meant for destruction. And we can imagine the tremendous power which is introduced into nitrate, and this nitrate now is introduced into plants. So we can see that there is something here with regard to the issue of energy imbalance. In French, nitrogen, the word for nitrogen, is azote, deprived of life. So we have disrupted a very fine-tuning in carbon to the balance between carbon and nitrate and nitrogen. And so this is a vital disruption. So I think this is a very important issue that would need to be considered, not just focusing on carbon all the time, but also on the evolution of nitrogen. I think over the last century, there's been a politicization of plant powers or plant agentivities, but these have not been explicitly stated as such. And the first phase was the emergence of organic agriculture movements. There are a diversity of movements, and they have in common to make a protest against soilless agriculture that impose an undue nutrition on crops. And the second phase was later, at the end of the 20th century, with the emergence of seed networks. And this is a manifesto against seed grabbing, and that imposes an undue lockdown on crops. Now, when I was at this conference, this World Congress last September, there were people discussing about the necessity to head for a third, what I call a third phase, just because we are just realizing that organic agriculture is just becoming one more stream of agribusiness. So there is the need to invent a new narrative for organic development. So one aspect which I have stressed during this Congress is how to develop participatory narratives on what it is to be a plant. So now we need to define clearly plant ontologies. Maybe there are different plant ontologies, but we need to define what is an organic plant ontology. Okay, so I think also there's a very important aspect is to link the governance of crop potentiality, because crop potentiality it has implication for the whole of the development of our societies. So to link this governance of crop potentiality with human food rights is a major step which should be considered now. Thank you.
Et donc, ça ne marche qu'avec ça. Je suis désolé.
Thank you. I'm the last one for today, so I won't be too long. I've prepared something which is much too long. and through the whole day, I had the feeling that what I'm working on, which is the responsibilities of companies and especially multinational corporations at an international level, it's such at odds with all what we say about our sisters, the plants, that I had to find a way to combine the reflection. And my idea was just to say something about the Great Transition Handbook that I co-directed with Christophe Goupil, who is the deputy director of the LEAD lab. And we used 6 gates in order to help us reflect collectively on challenges related to ecological and social transition in our societies. The 6 gates are Greek words related to the Greek words that are present in the words economy and ecology. So oikos, which has to see with the diagnostic about the situation at a global level. Then we have used nomos, which is about the regulations that are needed or that currently exist. And we can say that there is something about today reification has to see with commodification, financialization, as Marine mentioned it also this morning. And then we have logos. Logos is about the clash of rationalities. And all what we have heard this afternoon, also with the anthropological perspectives, show us that it's really necessary for us to not only to develop a techno-scientific rationality, but also to build on symbolic rationality. So it's logos. Then we have ethos, which is how to ask, to raise ethical questions about the kind of life we want to live together, and not only with human beings, but also with non-humans, with not only sentient animals, but our sisters, the plants, and the ecosystems as a whole. And then praxis is about the scales of actions, the different kinds of actors. And finally, dynamis, that has to see with the reconnections of ourselves with nature, with others, and maybe with beyond ourselves. And I would like to say just briefly something about... Doesn't work. Yes. Well, this is okay. And so I put the donut, maybe the donut economics proposed by the image of a donut, proposed by Kate Travers, who is an economist, and who say that in the end, the aim of our societies is try to create wealth while respecting a social floor and an ecological ceiling. And I think what was just mentioned by Sylvie about dynamic ontologies has to see with this idea that we have to reflect on the kind of perspective on creating goods or taking care of the plants and nature in general, and see how we can respect planetary boundaries while developing economic models that build on different ontologies and perspectives. So maybe, and if I recall what David Graeber said, he was insisting on the fact that when we look at the history of our societies, we could differentiate between communal economics, economics in common, which has to see with the production of social bonds, and maybe we could say that it's not only a creation of social bonds, but also of quality ecological bonds, and reflect on an economic models which respect these planetary limits. And it means that we can reflect from a nomos perspective, integrating oikos, the diagnostic, and ethical criteria. And while, of course, reflecting on global common narratives, and that was also what was just said by Sylvie. So I will be very brief, but I wanted to just to say something about an analysis that I did trying to look at the raison d'être of the CAC 40 companies and trying to analyze the vision that was underpinning the raison d'être expression of these companies, and trying to analyze whether what kind of environmental ethics was at work. And as some scholars highlight, when we speak of corporate sustainability management, it includes CSR and corporate political activity. It means lobbying and environmental management. And so I cannot detail, but and we have spoken today of different ways of looking at environmental ethics. We can speak of sustainable use of resources, preservation and conservation, defense of the rights of species and ecosystems, or deep ecology. And all these different perspectives can be linked to different ethical approaches, either deontological or theological or consequentialists. And maybe what is more interesting for us is to ask whether these ethics are anthropocentric or pathocentric, focused on sentient animals' rights and obligations toward these sentient animals, or if we have to consider our sisters, the plants, it means more bio-centered ethics, or if we have to prefer an eco-centered ethics. So there are many debates. And then there is another strong debate about the way that we consider resources as substitutable one to the other, one another, which is related to a weak sustainability perspective, or if we have to understand the resources are not substitutable and insist on a strong sustainability. And if we look at the discourse and at the actions of companies, we see, of course, that corporate sustainability management almost exclusively adopts an instrumental and utilitarian perspective that is focused on optimizing the use of resources and their conservation, according to a weak sustainability approach. So if we want to favor what has been just said about agriculture, but we could say that it's a problem for all sectors, because all sectors have to see in a way or another with nature, and especially with the plants. We have to reflect differently and try to raise ethical questions that are translated into changing norms and regulations. With other scholars, we reflected on what I call a relational eco-justice that has to see both with the creation and sustainable and equitable sharing of the wealth created, but which has to see also with the recognition and care of stakeholders, including the most vulnerable beings. That has to see also with what Marine was mentioning this morning about looking at the rights of living beings and maybe the obligations, justice obligations that we have towards these beings. And then political aspect, which has to see with the participation or the representation of those affected. I won't detail, but maybe just say that if we look at the raison d'être, the corporate purposes of the biggest French companies, some of them do not have any raison d'être, and out of the 31 that do have a raison d'être, 22 do not mention a sustainability objective for the planet and humanity, and the only one that has a raison d'être that includes a strong sustainability perspective is NG. So, and the raison d'être is acting to accelerate the transition to a carbon-neutral economy through more frugal energy and environmentally friendly solutions. And you see that there is nothing about biodiversity and respecting the plants, respecting nature. So that's why it's, for me, very impressive to listen to all what we have discussed today and see that economic actors, even those who claim that they want to be respectful of the planet, in fact have a discourse and then have action that has nothing to see with the respect of planetary boundaries. And that's why, well, I switched to the last part of, because it's maybe more interesting to discuss, but if we ask whether the raison d'être is an expression of corporate accountability, we can say that there are, of course, many limitations, and there is, for those who are interested about the legal perspective, Pauline Abadi has detailed what she sees as some positive aspects of the expression of the raison d'être by the big companies, but we can say that for the time being, of course, it's not sufficient at all, and from an ethical and legal perspective, if we want things to really progress against reification and financialization of nature, we have to reflect on a regulatory framework that is different. It means reflecting on accounting, and I cannot detail, but we have to really change the accounting standards. It's not possible to use resources as we have used it in a balance sheet to not to take to try to assess the price of maintaining resources and social capital. The term is not not good, but anyway. And then we have to see standards related to taxation. Well. To synthesize, we have to look differently at all the metrics that enable us to assess the way profit is made and shared. And coming back to nomos and the different gates, I think that these rules cannot change if we don't change our common representations. It means that we have to reflect differently, and this means that we have to include an ethical perspective and also in curricula in engineering, business schools and universities if we really want to change the way we look at the business models. And maybe favor new managerial ecological virtues, such as humility, that has to see with humus and the soil and the way we are. 2 minutes, yes. And I just finish with a scheme that it has its limitation, but it's a way to say that when we speak of CSR, we'd better speak not only of corporate social responsibility, but of corporate systemic responsibility, and try to combine a reflection on social responsibility, societal and environmental responsibility, which is the usual way with which the companies are looking at CSR, RSE, but we have to add a reflection on economic and financial creation, value and value creation and value sharing, and reflect on political responsibility of the companies. It means maybe looking at the ways by which companies which claim that they want to take a role in order to respect the planet, consider their role in terms of advocacy for new regulations and not only for lobbying for private interests. So it is maybe very idealistic, and that's why we need public regulations. But having spent the last 20 years discussing with people working in big companies, also in NGOs, trying to promote advocacy, and we were discussing this, I think that, of course, we are very, very far, and it's quite depressing to see how far we are collectively. And I think the COP26 was also showing that, well, we can be very anxious about the future. But I also see, and we have many people coming at Forge, at the campus, many young engineers who come and who say that they want really to favor new regulations. I remember 20 years ago when I was a PhD student, discussions with CEOs from 2 big multinationals who told me that they were discussing privately about this with me. And they said, well, what we know in big companies, we know how to integrate constraints. It means that we have to be imposed new constraints. And the other thing that they said, we couldn't say this publicly, but we are in favor of active NGOs because they are threatening the shareholder value and mean that our reputation, the shareholder value, that it means if we want to change, we really have to have confrontations. So it was interesting. It was said 20 years ago, and I think it's all the more true. And and then it says something about the way we can integrate, and I come back to what is for me the key aspect in our curricula, all these reflections that we have had today. So thanks for having invited me in this place. Thanks.
Thanks all the speakers to have been both short and precise, and we now have plenty of time to discuss. So if you have questions, please. Please wait for the microphone because we want this has been recorded. So yeah, thank you for waiting.
Merci. Je voudrais ajouter un petit mot à ce qu'a dit Nathalie. Je suis là. Comme on ne se refait pas, ce sera un petit mot exotique et on va retourner en Amazonie. Il y a énormément de langues amazoniennes qui n'ont pas de mot pour verre. Et quand on discute avec elles, elles nous disent « Mais vous êtes fous, vous les Européens, à toujours vouloir mettre du vert, du vert, du vert. C'est pas une couleur, le vert. » Ah bon, alors qu'est-ce que c'est? Et au bout de plusieurs années, on se rend compte que en discutant avec eux, le vert, c'est la couleur dans laquelle ils sont imbibés tout le temps. Donc, il n'y a pas besoin de donner de nom à la couleur verte. Et comme ils se sont rendus compte que nous, on en a besoin, enfin, en tout cas, maintenant, encore pire, quand on parle de green ceci et green cela, ils ont fini par dire, bon, d'accord, ce qu'on peut appeler vert, c'est le bleu. Alors, le bleu, vous pouvez le traduire par vert, ça ne nous gêne pas. Mais en réalité, la seule couleur qu'ils aiment, c'est le rouge. Le rouge. Voilà.
Just to try to have a short translation for people not speaking French. Like you said, that a lot of languages in South America, people living in the forest, they do not have the word green. The green by itself does not exist because they are embedded in green, they live in green, and so they don't think it's a color, and they ask them, what have you Europeans with this? Green is not a color. And now they admit to, use something that could define green, but in fact it's blue. And the only color they see and they love, and it's a plain color for them, is red. No other question? Yeah? A question there, please? It's more a remark than a question.
Oui, je parlerai en français parce qu'il est tard. Bon, écoute, Françoise, en Nouvelle-Guinée, c'est la même chose. Quand il y a vraiment une trop grosse masse de verre, il y a saturation et le terme n'existe pas. J'ai quelques artistes qui sont passés par la forêt où je travaille et eux considéraient qu'il y avait une palette de gris extraordinaire. Moi, à l'intérieur, j'ai l'impression que c'est marron. Mais c'est vrai que le terme vert n'existe pas, et s'ils s'en réfèrent, ils utilisent la jeune pousse, enfin le jeune pousse, ce vert gorgé d'eau. Voilà. Moi, la question, c'était plutôt... je me souviens plus de ton prénom. Le premier. Sur la philosophie, sur la philosophie des sciences, et tu n'as pas cité, ou je ne sais pas si c'est opportun, mais on a quand même un philosophe du végétal, Marder. Je ne sais pas si tu l'as lu. Marder.
Oui, je connais bien Michael Mardeur, oui,
Ouais,
bien sûr.
voilà.
C'est une question de temps qui fait que j'ai évidemment pas pu développer tous les aspects philosophiques et que j'ai dû ici donner une lecture très trop synthétique même de toutes ces questions, évidemment.
Oui, alors je voulais rebondir je voulais pas dire que tu manquais de culture. Hein. Je voulais juste te dire que par rapport, on parlait tout à l'heure d'obstacles épistémologiques, de biais cognitifs, etc., etc. Et moi, j'avais beaucoup apprécié toute son interprétation sur le fait qu'il manquait. Et tout à l'heure, c'était le titre, Nathalie, de ton exposé. Là, c'était comme un peu une angoisse. On voyait l'angoisse des plantes. Hein. Il y a beaucoup de gens qui sont angoissés par les plantes. Hein, ça existe vraiment. Et qui parlait qui soulevait la question dans son article, je crois que ça s'appelait empathie versus apathie, et combien les plantes subissaient un déficit d'empathie. Et je voulais savoir ce que tu pensais de ce point de vue et l'impact justement de cet historique que tu nous as donné dans les sciences et qui se pose dans la thématique de ce colloque, quoi.
C'est une question intéressante parce qu'elle fait le lien avec l'anthropologie, je pense, justement, et la philosophie, l'histoire de la philosophie. Et à mon sens, c'est vraiment lié de nouveau... Pardon ?
Il faut pas parler en anglais.
Ah oui.
Je vais te renoncer à traduire.
Ben, je vais peut-être poursuivre en français, du coup. En fait, c'est vraiment lié à la fois notre histoire de la philosophie et donc notre culture au sens anthropologique, où j'ai l'impression que ce dualisme nature-culture, qui est quand même typique des cultures, de la culture occidentale par rapport à d'autres cultures dont on a évoqué les traditions ce matin, se caractérise par cette opposition entre d'un côté la nature et puis la civilisation humaine, la ville, typiquement. De nouveau, on l'a aussi évoqué cette idée que c'était cristallisé par la ville. Et en fait, la nature, à l'inverse de la ville, elle est essentiellement végétale. C'est-à-dire qu'une acception de la nature, c'est tout ce qui est de l'ordre de la végétation, de la forêt, justement, ce qu'on n'a pas défriché ou essarté, pour pouvoir y installer la ville ou on va dire l'extension de la ville qui est la campagne cultivée. Et donc, en fait, la végétalité qui incarne cette nature apparaît comme le sauvage, le dangereux, ce qu'on ne parvient pas à maîtriser, contrairement à l'animal qu'on peut individualiser dans une certaine mesure ou chasser. La végétation, elle est toujours massivement là, elle pousse. On peut à certains moments gagner un peu sur elle, mais enfin, elle nous englobe et elle cerne la ville. Et donc, de là vient évidemment le sentiment de l'angoisse, dans une certaine mesure. Et je pense que ce n'est pas non plus par hasard que, par exemple, Sartre, quand il parle de l'angoisse dans la nausée, il prend l'exemple des végétaux, de la racine de marronnier. Il parle aussi du fait que la ville est cernée par le cercle de la végétation qui la menace, etc. Parce que c'est profondément intégré dans notre culture occidentale, en raison de ce dualisme et de cette idée de la domination de l'homme sur d'autres formes de vie, les animaux et les végétaux. Mais il y a une résistance beaucoup plus grande du monde, ou en tout cas peut-être une massivité du monde végétal plus grande, qui fait que ça suscite aussi cette angoisse, puisque ce fantasme de domination, il n'est clairement pas réaliste, c'est une illusion, mais qui a des conséquences bien réelles qui sont néfastes. Hein.
Oui, on peut ramener ça aussi à l'angoisse qu'on voit souvent, qui a été décrite dans les villages où les terres agricoles reculent et où les gens perçoivent comme une angoisse ce retour de la forêt qui vient enfermer, mettre du sombre dans le village. Et on retrouve ça notamment dans le centre de la France, où la forêt gagne beaucoup de terrain, où il y a des témoignages comme ça de gens qui se disent oppressés par cet enfermement végétal des villages.
En fait, elle prenait comment ça s'appelle, parce que ça je l'ai vu de mes propres yeux, le sédum, je veux dire, et des plaquettes de sédum, et lorsqu'il y a eu la crise des réfugiés Donc moi je suis j'étais présidente d'un théâtre alternatif qui était à Jean Carré, où il y a eu la masse des réfugiés, la première vague des réfugiés qui a débarqué à Paris pendant les vacances politiques de nos politiciens. Et donc ça a été extraordinaire et très violent, etc. Et pour faire oublier tout ça aux populations riveraines, parce qu'il y a eu de la saleté, enfin voilà, il y avait le côté, la déchéance, la saleté, enfin bon, il y avait beaucoup de... Et pour se faire pardonner, donc ils avaient investi à peu près 200 000 euros pour recouvrir là où était empaqueté, pas empaqueté, mais enfin, tous ces réfugiés. Comme c'est entouré de tours, là, place des Fêtes, de ces dômes. Et là, ils sont en train de tout détruire pour refaire une médiathèque. Et tout le Sédom est redescendu, ils allaient le jeter. Mais il y a un côté, enfin moi j'ai trouvé dans la politique très volontariste, là, des 1000 hectares, etc., avec cette volonté de domination sur le végétal. C'est-à-dire qu'on veut bien vous accorder 1 mètre carré pour planter, pour vous faire plaisir, quoi. Mais voilà, il faut quand même demander une autorisation, etc. Donc vraiment pour éviter ce débordement, quoi, et garder un contrôle absolu sur la vivacité de... Je trouve que ça rejoint les deux.
On observe ce contrôle.
Bonjour, merci pour ces présentations, c'était super intéressant. Et juste pour revenir, juste pour faire un tout petit apport rapide sur l'angoisse liée à la végétation, ce que je trouve intéressant, c'est qu'en ce moment, il y a un genre de littérature qui se développe beaucoup, qui est une sous-branche du roman noir, qui en fait serait le roman noir mais vert, qui prend pour cadre en fait beaucoup de milieux naturels et particulièrement des milieux forestiers. Donc il y a un roman qui s'appelle Chien-loup, j'ai oublié l'auteur, qui se passe dans le Vercors. Et en fait, il y a tout un tas d'exemples dans ce genre où la végétation est source d'angoisse à part entière. Voilà, c'est tout ce que...
Juste une petite remarque. Je me rappelle pendant la période de confinement où il y a un maire de l'agglomération parisienne qui est revenu en disant, c'était une tribune dans Le Monde, je crois, qu'il fallait écarter toute nature de la ville pour éviter et donc éradiquer d'une certaine manière la végétation pour éviter de rapprocher l'épidémie d'une certaine manière. Donc il y a quand même cette idée d'un espace absolument pur. En fait, le rêve de pureté, enfin le fantasme plus exactement, est toujours là, extrêmement présent dans les esprits par rapport à cette question de l'angoisse.
Oui, et peut-être pour ajouter quelque chose sur ce sujet qui va dans le sens de ce que vous disiez tout à l'heure dans votre exposé, c'est que même l'usage du végétal en ville est extrêmement réglementé. Donc vous n'avez pas le droit de planter un arbre devant votre maison, quoi. C'est parce que il y a justement un potentiel prolifique des plantes qui va gêner dans l'espace public. Et quand bien même certaines plantes sont plantées dans l'espace public, de nouveau par exemple les arbres des allées, en fait tout est orienté, comme vous l'avez bien dit, sur l'intérêt que ces végétaux représentent pour les citadins, mais absolument pas en prenant en compte les propriétés intrinsèques de ce type de plantes. Et donc on arrive à des absurdités écologiques qui est par exemple le fait que pour des raisons esthétiques, on va planter une rangée d'arbres qui sont souvent des clones, qui auront donc le même âge, les mêmes faiblesses par rapport aux maladies, aux épidémies, et qui rendront, entre guillemets, exactement les mêmes services écosystémiques ou écologiques. Donc en fait, ces arbres, s'il y en a un qui est malade, en général, on va tous les abattre parce qu'ils sont vulnérables à la même maladie. Et donc, il faut recommencer. Et en plus, ils offrent un seul type de nourriture ou un seul type de, entre guillemets, service écosystémique à la biodiversité. Donc, en fait, c'est même une aberration écologique. Pourquoi est-ce qu'on ne plante pas des arbres d'essence différentes sur les avenues? On pourrait avoir des avenues où on a des arbres d'âge, d'espèces différentes qui font des choses différentes. Mais en fait, pour des raisons principalement esthétiques, je pense, et peut-être même réglementaires, hein, si c'est réglementé, on ne peut a priori même pas le faire. Donc,
que là aussi, on peut s'emparer de ça pour justement s'emparer de l'esthétique pour changer les choses, parce que de fait, c'est une esthétique du jardin à la française, et c'est qu'une esthétique des jardins parmi...
Je pense qu'il y a quand même, parce qu'on le voit dans le monde rural, hein, par exemple, si tu tombes pas ta pelouse, j'en ai discuté avec Gilles Lecuir à Nature Paris, tu peux être attaqué par tes voisins. Enfin, il y a quand même une esthétique du propre, et donc ça conduit encore une fois, cette question de l'hygiène, du propre, etc., qui est très profond, et que la Covid n'a pas dû soulager, en fait, hein, parce qu'on voit que ça réactive pour certains beaucoup d'angoisse par rapport à ces questions-là. Mais il y a cette espèce de frontière à créer entre le naturel et nous, d'une certaine manière, qui est quelque chose qui est un projet toujours présent, enfin à titre fantasmagorique, mais toujours présent. C'est
et ça nécessite du temps. Une responsable des espaces verts de la mairie de Paris, avec laquelle on travaille beaucoup, nous a raconté, elle a dit qu'il a fallu 10 ans pour qu'il y ait l'arrêt d'un flux de protestations contre les mauvaises herbes dans la rue, ou, pire que tout, les mauvaises herbes dans les cimetières. Aujourd'hui, ça nous semble tout à fait naturel d'aller au Père-Lachaise et dans ce foisonnement qu'il y a aujourd'hui dans le Père-Lachaise. Mais pendant 10 ans, ils ont reçu des courriers disant que c'était manquer de respect aux morts. Donc vraiment, c'est quelque chose qui... Voilà, il faut le temps de changer d'esthétique. Exactement.
Et j'avais une question, c'était pour rebondir sur cette dichotomie entre nature et ville. Et on a parlé aussi de la production de nouveaux narratifs, et notamment pour avoir travaillé avant en conseil, en développement durable, tout ça, pour maintenant être apprenti botaniste, pour vous dire qu'il y a du chemin qui est fait aussi dans les mentalités. Moi, j'ai l'impression que en fait, la nature est maintenant dans notre société quand même un concept en tant que tel, parce que, enfin, qu'est-ce que vraiment la nature? J'ai pas vu vraiment de définition qui a été proposée. Je crois que la nature en elle-même est un nouveau narratif dans une société aussi qui cherche à se renouveler. J'aurais voulu avoir votre avis sur cette notion-là. Est-ce que finalement, c'est pas entre la privatisation des terres agricoles, la privatisation de nos forêts, qu'est-ce qu'on appelle vraiment la nature? Est-ce que finalement, on n'est pas en train de débattre de quelque chose de très conceptuel, et peut-être que dans les narratifs, c'est aussi de rendre de plus en plus concret qu'est-ce que la nature?
Oui, je suis tout à fait d'accord. Et d'ailleurs, vous mentionniez là le terme de développement durable. On sait bien que c'est tellement une coquille vide en un sens, parce qu'il fait référence à une abstraction qu'est la nature ou le respect de l'environnement. Et précisément, je trouve qu'un des défis, c'est quand même d'arriver à articuler l'expérience sensible que nous faisons de la nature, des milieux dans lesquels nous sommes, avec quand même l'idée qu'il y a des règles du jeu à changer d'un niveau global, et donc aussi du point de vue de la lutte contre le réchauffement climatique, aussi une conception... il y a forcément quelque chose d'un peu abstrait à se représenter, ce que va être la nature pour les générations futures. Et du coup, c'est ça, je trouve, qui est peut-être à faire expérimenter. C'est concrètement dans les espaces où je suis, et d'où toute cette réflexion et sur ce qui se passe autant en ville que dans les zones rurales, comment je suis connectée à ces milieux vivants et à ces différentes manières d'expérimenter au quotidien le rapport au climat ou autre. Et moi, je suis très frappée de ça, parce que ça fait 4 ans que je vis quatrième année, dans un bâtiment du XVIIIe siècle qui est une vraie passoire énergétique, donc peu chauffée. Et je peux dire que là, on voit ce que c'est que d'attendre le printemps. Et là, on commence l'hiver. On dit, ça y est, pour certains, 8 le matin dans leur chambre quand ils se réveillent. Bon, et du coup, on prend conscience de ce que c'était pour les générations qui nous ont précédés, où c'était habituel. Et en fait, on est dans un monde tellement aseptisé à certains égards, et avec cette idée, voilà, à la fois quelque chose du propre, du homogène, de standard, enfin tout ce qu'on disait, enfin une certaine forme d'architecture, etc., qu'on perd cette expérience-là très concrète. Et du coup, je trouve que lutter contre les narratifs type le grand récit néolibéral du développement durable, c'est une façon de revisiter d'autres narratifs du rapport, justement peut-être aux plantes. Et c'est pour ça que je trouve que l'idée de parler de nos sœurs les plantes, c'est une manière extrêmement forte, je trouve, de retrouver un lien concret. Et on pourrait sans doute l'élargir à d'autres éléments naturels.
Oui, moi, je veux vraiment aller dans le même sens que ce qui a été dit, dans la mesure où ce narratif de la nature est justement un héritage philosophique, mais même un peu plutôt idéologique, en fait, qui est très abstrait. Évidemment, c'est des conceptualisations. Et c'est pour ça que quand je parlais de cette opposition nature-culture, en fait, je préfère l'illustrer par la végétalité qui incarne historiquement cette idée qu'on peut mettre derrière le mot de nature, plutôt que de parler de nature en général. Parce que sinon, on tombe exactement dans ce qu'on vient de dire, c'est-à-dire on va parler il faut protéger l'environnement, il faut protéger la nature, mais en fait, derrière, on ne voit pas les relations concrètes qu'on noue avec des types d'organismes, avec des types de sols, avec des enjeux éthiques bien particuliers, quelle nourriture on mange, etc. Donc en fait, parler des plantes plutôt que parler de la nature ou l'environnement, c'est aussi une façon de reconcrétiser, recontextualiser le débat autour de la nourriture, l'agriculture, la politique agricole, l'éthique des sols, en fait des choses très concrètes. Voilà.
Je déteste ce que je vais faire là, mais il va être bientôt 18h, donc on prend encore une question. C'est simplement pour pouvoir libérer dans des horaires, l'équipe technique dans des horaires.
Merci. Merci. Madame, je voudrais revenir sur ce que vous avez dit sur la sensation qu'on a de la chaleur et donc de la saisonnalité. Il y a une autre chose qu'on peut ajouter immédiatement à ce que vous venez de dire, c'est la lumière. Oui. On a complètement perdu l'idée de ce que peut être le noir. Et je suis toujours frappée quand je regarde un film. Bien entendu, les pauvres cinéastes, ils n'arrivent pas à rendre le noir, parce que sinon on verrait rien. Mais les trois quarts des choses qu'ils montrent, en particulier pour le temps d'avant, les temps historiques, c'était dans le noir. La Saint-Barthélemy, elle s'est faite dans un noir total. C'est d'ailleurs pour ça qu'ils ne savaient pas trop bien qui recevait le coup de dague ou pas. Hein. Mais enfin bref, cette histoire de lumière, elle est importante. D'ailleurs, vous remarquerez, la mairie de Paris insiste plus du tout sur la ville lumière. Hein. C'est fini, maintenant il faut faire des économies. Donc la ville lumière, elle n'existe plus.
Mais ceci dit, la baisse de l'éclairage public est une tendance est vraiment quelque chose qu'il faut soutenir, parce que c'est une pollution effectivement extrêmement insidieuse, la pollution lumineuse, et dont on ne se rend finalement compte que depuis récemment, parce que jusque-là, les gens, les humains, les gens adoraient voir des lumières la nuit, parce que justement, c'est pas naturel et que c'est quelque chose qui est excitant, qui libère des ténèbres, qui libère de la peur, etc., etc., etc. Et je sais pas, mais moi, quand j'étais étudiant, il y a une trentaine d'années, on ne parlait pas de pollution lumineuse. Quand on faisait des cours sur la pollution, elle était complètement ignorée.
Les astronomes en parlaient déjà.
Oui.
Les astronomes savaient déjà qu'il fallait qu'ils aillent de plus en plus loin pour avoir un ciel.
Oui. Mais eux, c'était des vrais scientifiques. Nous, on n'était que des biologistes.
D'accord. Oui, moi je voulais juste, je suis bavarde, quand tu as introduit la notion d'esthétique, et il y a aussi un aspect avec lequel il faut conjuguer, c'est la temporalité du végétal, qui n'est pas forcément le nôtre, loin de là. Quelquefois il est plus rapide et quelquefois beaucoup plus lent. Et je me rappelle de comment on appelle ça, le conflit qu'il y a eu au Quai Branly avec Clément, parce qu'il voulait faire pousser justement des choses qui s'autogénèrent, sauvages, en ces termes. Et en fait, la direction s'est plainte. Parce que pendant 4 ans, c'était moche. Il était là, mais attendez, et il y a eu vraiment un gros conflit, un bras de fer. Il a failli tout quitter, tout arracher, parce que la direction voulait planter des choses qui soient immédiatement jolies, décoratives, plutôt que d'attendre le temps que ce qu'il voulait planter de libre soit... Donc il y a aussi cette temporalité quand même qui apporte une altérité et une difficulté à créer des co-gestions aussi. Enfin, je veux dire...